Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. Around January 2023, my buddy Mike made what could only be called a terrible financial decision by buying a brand new car he had no business even looking at. His insurance was running him about $400 monthly, and he was only making $15.50 an hour as an assistant manager at Burger King. The real killer? His car payment was sitting at $795 a month. Let's do some quick math here. At $15.50 an hour, working 30 hours a week, he was pulling in roughly $450 a week, or about $1,800 monthly. Still nowhere near enough. Mike came to me because I'd spent 5 years in car sales and knew all the tricks of the trade. Looking over his paperwork, I could see the dealer had definitely taken advantage of him, jacked up warranty prices, inflated APR, unnecessary add-ons, the whole 9 yards. But here's the thing, being sleazy isn't illegal. I knew our only shot at getting Mike out of this mess was finding something that actually broke the law. Man, I'm really in deep here, aren't I? Mike asked, running his hands through his hair. Let me check something, I said, examining his finance application. The income section caught my eye. Mike had filled it out correctly. That's when it hit me. Wait a second, I muttered. No bank would touch this deal with your income. Looking deeper into the paperwork, I found what I was searching for. The application the dealer had submitted to the bank. Dealers typically transfer handwritten applications to electronic format. That's standard practice. But what wasn't standard was what I found. On the dealer's submission to the bank, they'd listed Mike as the regional manager of Burger King, claiming he made $70,000 annually. Mike had decent credit, which probably explained why the bank hadn't asked for proof of income. I walked into the dealership with Mike the next day, heading straight to the sales manager, Tom. "You might want to get your general manager down here," I said calmly. "We need to discuss unwinding Mike's deal and returning his trade-in," Tom laughed. "Sure, buddy, whatever you say." The GM, Steve, came out wearing the same smirk. "What seems to be the problem here?" "Let me show you something interesting," I said, laying out both applications side by side. "See this? Mike's actual income is $18,000. Your finance department reported $70,000. That's bank fraud, Steve. A felony." The color drained from Steve's face. "Oh. Yeah. Oh. Look," Steve said, straightening his tie. "Maybe we can work something out. Simple. Unwind the deal, give Mike his trade-in back." Steve shifted uncomfortably. "We've already sold his trade-in." "Then here's what's going to happen," I leaned forward. "You're going to find him something as good or better than what he traded in." "You expect us to just give him a car?" Steve scoffed. "I expect you to fix your mistake before we talk to a consumer protection attorney," I replied. "Your choice." Steve disappeared into his office, returning with an offer. "We have a 2018 Focus, similar mileage." "Not good enough," I cut him off. "His trade-in was better." "Come on, man, I'm trying to give him a free car here." "No, you're trying to avoid a fraud charge. Big difference." Mike whispered, "Maybe we should take it." "Trust me," I whispered back. "Wait for it." As we stood up to leave, Steve called out, "Hold on, I've got a 2019 Civic. 5,000 more miles, but it's a better car overall." I looked at Mike, who nodded eagerly. "Deal," I said. They processed the paperwork, canceled the original loan, and took back the new car that they'd now have to sell as used. Mike drove home in a better car than he'd traded in, with no payments. For those wondering why we didn't go straight to a lawyer, sure, we could have. But legal battles drag on forever, and Mike needed to get to work on Monday. Sometimes the direct approach works best. The next one is an entitled people story. I never thought I'd be writing one of these stories, but here we are. This all started about 2 years ago when my new neighbor moved in next door to my 15-acre property in rural Pennsylvania. I'm a 45-year-old software developer who works remotely, and I bought this land specifically for the peace, quiet, and privacy it offers. I've lived here happily for 8 years, turning part of the land into a small hobby farm with chickens and a large vegetable garden. Enter Richard Thompson, not his real name, a 50-something executive who bought the adjacent 2-acre property. From day one, it was clear Richard thought the rules didn't apply to him. The first time we met, he barely acknowledged me with a dismissive wave while his landscapers were already cutting down trees right on our property line without checking where it actually was. "Excuse me," I called out, walking over to where they were working. "I think you might be cutting down some trees on my property." Richard, wearing designer sunglasses and what looked like a $500 polo shirt, barely glanced my way. "Oh, don't worry about it. These trees are blocking my view of the valley. They need to go." "That's not really your decision to make," I replied firmly. "The property line is marked with survey stakes. These trees are clearly on my land." He scoffed. Come on, don't be difficult. They're just trees. I'll even let you keep the firewood. Let me? They're my trees. Please stop cutting them down immediately, or I'll have to call the police for property damage. That got his attention. He waved off the landscapers and turned to face me fully for the first time. Listen here, he said, taking off his sunglasses. I paid 7 figures for this property, and I intend to make some improvements. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I'm Richard Thompson, Senior VP at Lancaster Capital. Nice to meet you, Richard. I'm Jake Miller, and while I appreciate you want to make improvements, you need to stick to your own property. He laughed like I'd just told a mildly amusing joke. Jake, I can tell you're a reasonable guy. How about I cut you a check for $1,000 for the trees? That's more than fair. No thanks. Just please respect the property line going forward. Richard's smile tightened. You know, being neighborly goes both ways. You might want to think about that. I should have known then that this was just the beginning. Over the next few months, Richard proved to be the neighbor from hell. He'd have loud parties that went well past midnight with drunk guests wandering onto my property. His landscapers would blow leaves and grass clippings onto my land. He'd accidentally let his dogs run loose on my property, frightening my chickens. Each time I confronted him, he'd either deny everything or act like I was being unreasonable for complaining. They're just leaves, Jake. The wind blows them around anyway. Or, come on, the dogs are just having fun. Don't be such a buzzkill. The final straw came when I caught him walking across my back field one Sunday morning like he owned the place. He had a coffee in one hand and was talking loudly on his phone about some business deal. Richard, I called out, walking toward him, what are you doing on my property? He held up a finger in the universal wait a minute gesture and continued his call for another minute before hanging up. Just taking my morning constitutional, he said with that smug smile. Beautiful morning for a walk, isn't it? This isn't public land, Richard. You can't just walk wherever you want. He waved his hand dismissively. Oh, please, you're not using this field for anything. It's just sitting here empty. Besides, I'm thinking about making an offer to buy a few acres from you. This would make a perfect spot for a tennis court and pool house. I stared at him in disbelief. The property isn't for sale, and you're trespassing. Please leave. Don't be so provincial, Jake. Everything's for sale for the right price. Think about it. You could probably use the money to fix up that... He gestured vaguely at my house. Modest home of yours. Last warning, Richard. Stay off my property. He just chuckled and started walking back toward his house. We'll see about that. That's when I decided enough was enough. It was time to teach Richard a lesson about respecting other people's property rights. But I needed to do it legally, and in a way that would actually make an impact on someone like him. First, I installed security cameras covering all the areas where he typically trespassed. Not cheap wireless cameras, but a professional-grade system with night vision and motion detection. I also put up no trespassing signs every 50 feet along our shared property line, more than required by law. Then I called my cousin Sarah, who happens to be a real estate attorney. After explaining the situation, she helped me draft an official cease and desist letter documenting all the previous incidents of trespassing and property damage. We sent it certified mail so he couldn't claim he never received it. Richard's response? He started walking across my property even more frequently, sometimes with business associates in tow, acting like he was showing off the land. The security cameras caught it all. I hired a licensed surveyor to do a complete property survey and mark all boundaries clearly with permanent markers. Cost me $2,000, but it was worth every penny. I also had them create detailed maps and documentation of the exact property lines. This would prove crucial later. Next, I installed motion-activated sprinklers in strategic locations, not your regular garden sprinklers. These were commercial-grade units that could shoot a powerful stream of water 40 feet. I placed them carefully so they'd only activate on my property, not near the boundary line where they might accidentally spray innocent passers-by. I also set up a few trail cameras in trees, giving different angles than the security cameras. Better to have too much evidence than not enough. Then I waited. It didn't take long. The very next weekend, Richard was hosting another one of his parties. Around 9 p.m., my security system alerted me to movement in the backfield. I checked the cameras to see Richard leading a group of about 6 people across my property. And this is where the tennis courts will go, I heard him saying through the camera's audio. Once I acquire this parcel, we'll level it out and... Whoosh! The sprinklers activated, catching the entire group with streams of cold water. Their reactions were priceless. Shrieks of surprise, expensive clothes soaked, phones dropped in panic. Richard stood there sputtering, looking around wildly for the source of the water. "What the hell?" he shouted. "Jake, I know you did this!" I watched from my security monitors as they all scrambled back to his property looking like drowned rats in their designer clothes. But I didn't confront them, not yet. I wanted to see what Richard would do next. The next morning, he stormed over to my front door, still looking angry. "What kind of childish stunt was that?" he demanded when I opened the door. "What stunt?" I asked innocently. "Oh, you mean the sprinklers? They're just part of my new security system. You know, to protect my property from trespassers. I have signs posted everywhere warning about them." "You deliberately set them up to spray me and my guests." "No, I set them up on my property to deter trespassers. They wouldn't have sprayed you if you hadn't been trespassing. By the way, how's that cease and desist letter working out for you?" His face turned red. "This isn't over," he growled, turning to leave. "Actually, Richard," I called after him, "it is over. The next time you trespass, I'm pressing charges. I have everything on video." But Richard couldn't help himself. 3 days later, my cameras caught him walking across my property again, this time in an expensive suit, apparently on his way to some meeting. The sprinklers got him good, ruining what I'm sure was a very pricey outfit. This time, he completely lost it. He started yelling and actually kicked one of the sprinkler heads, damaging it. All caught on multiple cameras, of course. That's when I called the police and my lawyer. The responding officers were professional but couldn't quite hide their amusement when they viewed the footage. Richard tried to argue that the sprinklers were set up to deliberately assault him, but the officers pointed out that they only activated on my clearly marked private property, and I had every right to install security measures. They cited him for criminal trespassing and vandalism for the damaged sprinkler, but that was just the beginning. My lawyer filed a civil suit against Richard for continued trespassing, property damage, including the trees he'd cut down during his first week, and harassment. We included all the documentation, videos, and witness statements from other neighbors who'd seen his behavior. Richard, being Richard, responded by hiring an expensive law firm and countersuing me for harassment and assault with the sprinklers. He clearly thought he could outspend me in legal fees and force me to back down. What he didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this possibility. Remember that professional survey I'd had done? Well, it revealed something interesting. Richard's fancy new fence and part of his pool house actually encroached on my property by about 3 feet. His builders had ignored the property lines when construction was done. When my lawyer brought this up during discovery, Richard's attitude suddenly changed. His lawyers reached out about settling the case, but I wasn't interested in a quick settlement. Richard had spent months making my life difficult, treating me like I was beneath him, and acting like rules didn't apply to him. It was time for him to learn otherwise. We took it to court. The judge was not impressed by Richard's attempts to play the victim, especially when we showed the video evidence of his repeated trespassing after receiving the cease and desist letter. The footage of him damaging the sprinkler while trespassing in his expensive suit was particularly damaging to his case. The judge's ruling was better than I could have hoped for. The judge ordered Richard to pay for all property damages, including the illegally cut trees, which, as it turns out, were worth quite a bit more than the $1,000 he'd offered, the damaged sprinkler, and my legal fees. He also had to move his fence and modify his pool house to respect the property line, all at his own expense. But the best part was the permanent injunction the judge issued. If Richard set foot on my property again, he'd be in contempt of court, facing significant fines and possible jail time. "Your Honor," Richard's lawyer tried to argue, "my client needs reasonable access to maintain his fence and pool house." The judge peered over his glasses. "Your client has demonstrated a pattern of willful disregard for property rights and court orders. If he needs to do maintenance, he can file a formal request with the court, giving Mr. Miller proper notice." Richard sat there fuming as the judge continued. "Furthermore, Mr. Thompson, I find your countersuit for harassment to be frivolous and possibly malicious. Mr. Miller took reasonable steps to protect his property after documenting multiple incidents of trespassing. The fact that you continue to trespass after receiving a cease and desist letter shows a concerning disregard for the law. The total damages came to just over $47,000, including legal fees. For Richard, that wasn't a huge amount of money, but the blow to his ego was priceless. Several of his country club friends had been witnesses in the case, having been present during the sprinkler incident, and the story quickly spread through his social circle. But the story doesn't end there. Richard, true to form, tried to retaliate in subtle ways. He started reporting me to the township for every possible code violation he could think of. Claimed my chicken coop was too close to the property line. It wasn't. Said my compost pile was attracting vermin. It wasn't. Complained about my security lights being too bright. They were well within regulations. Each time, township inspectors would come out, find nothing wrong, and leave. After the third false report, the township administrator called me. "Mr. Miller," she said, We're getting a lot of complaints from your neighbor, but our inspectors haven't found any violations. Is there something going on we should know about? I explained the situation and sent her the court documents from our case. She sighed. We've had other issues with Mr. Thompson since he moved in. He tried to build a helipad without permits last year. I'll make a note in the file about these nuisance complaints. A week later, Richard received a letter from the township warning him about making false reports and threatening to fine him if he continued. That's when he switched tactics. He started having his landscape company do maintenance work at 7 a.m. on Saturdays, right at the legal limit for noise ordinances. He'd park his guest cars in a way that made it difficult for my visitors to turn around in my driveway. Petty stuff that was annoying but just barely legal. So I got creative. I planted a row of fast-growing privacy trees along the property line, all well within regulations and perfectly positioned to block his view of the valley once they matured. I also installed a decorative fountain in my backfield, again totally legal, that provided pleasant white noise to cover up his early morning lawn care activities. Two can play the passive-aggressive game, Richard. The final straw for him came about 6 months after the court case. He was trying to sell some of his other properties and had a meeting with potential investors at his house. I know this because I overheard him bragging loudly on his back patio about his extensive land holdings and how he was about to acquire more local property for development. Right as he was leading his guests on a tour of his grounds, gesturing toward my property, my sprinkler system activated for its regular afternoon watering schedule. The investors laughed as Richard quickly herded them away from the property line, his face red with embarrassment. The next week, a for sale sign appeared in front of Richard's house. He moved out 3 months later, selling to a lovely retired couple who actually respect property boundaries. They even asked permission before accessing my land to repair their fence. The day Richard moved out, I happened to be checking my mailbox as the moving trucks were leaving. He saw me and walked over, looking somewhat deflated. "I hope you're happy," he said. "You won." I shook my head. This wasn't about winning, Richard. It was about respect and following the law. Those apply to everyone, even senior VPs. He stood there for a moment, then nodded slightly. Maybe I could have handled things differently, he admitted. It wasn't quite an apology, but from Richard, it was something. As he turned to leave, I called after him. By the way, those trees you cut down when you first moved in? They were 100-year-old black walnuts, worth about $10,000 each in lumber. You got off easy with the settlement. The look on his face was priceless. These days, my property is peaceful again. The new neighbors are friendly, but respectful of boundaries. My security cameras and sprinklers are still in place, but they rarely activate for anything more threatening than deer or raccoons. Sometimes when I'm working in my garden, I think about Richard and hope he learned something from our conflict. But then I see news articles about his new development projects in other counties, already generating complaints from neighbors, and I realize some people never change. At least he's not my problem anymore. And every time I see those sprinklers activate for their regular watering schedule, I can't help but smile, remembering the sight of Richard Thompson, self-important real estate mogul, running across my field in his soaking wet designer suit. The cost of the security system, legal fees, and surveys was substantial, but it was worth every penny to protect my property rights and teach an arrogant trespasser a lesson in humility. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about standing your ground and letting the law take its course. And if you're ever tempted to ignore property rights and trespass on someone's land, remember, you never know what security measures they might have in place. Those innocent-looking sprinklers might just ruin your $700 suit. The end. The next one is a petty revenge story. I was shopping for some small bits, lunches, bleach, a nuclear bunker supply of soft drinks for the long winter. Also, some cat and dog food. A smidge relevant, I've got 2 bags of shopping, tops, 1 for human consumption. I get to the tills, and I'm watching the family ahead load up, listening to Spotify, and a lady appears with 5 or so items. All the other tills are occupied with one person queuing. Self-checkout is dystopianly free, but yeah, who wants to support a job for a robot and his family? I open my trolley back a bit, thinking, you can go ahead of little old me with your 5 items, I am in no rush. I'm about to tell her to go ahead, and she mutters something. I can't hear her, so I take my earbuds out. She goes, "All for you, is it?" and gestures to my cart. "Me, the wife, and the critters," I say, and she rolls her eyes a bit. She looks over at the till, emptying up, and leans forward a bit, trying to skip ahead. So I close it off with my trolley. Don't trolley shame me, lady, whoever you are. Nice gestures are for nice people. She ended up wandering between the queues, wasting more time switching by the time I finished up. The next one is a malicious compliance story, a quick story about my uncle. So I was telling a story about my best friend and my dad brought up this funny story. My mother's brother, who passed years and years ago, was a foodie and a great chef. This guy loved to eat. It was like his calling. Anyways, Mom and Dad took Uncle to a seafood restaurant. Nothing famous nor fancy. They happened to be pilot testing an all-you-can-eat buffet Thursday. All you can eat are 4 words my uncle will go all out for. My uncle saw it as a challenge. It's this really all I can eat? Malicious compliance. Almost immediately, as they set their coats down, Uncle went to the buffet. Uncle, as Dad tells it, heaped on the food. His first plates were of the try one of these, try some of these, and so forth. He essentially sampled one of each of the items on the table. Round 2, he does the same sampling. By round 3, he's still waltzing to the buffet, while poor Mom and Dad are trying to finish their round 2 and considering dessert. Round 3, Uncle focusing on his favorites. Mom and Dad sat for nearly 2 hours for him to get up to round 7. By then, the restaurant had reset the buffet table twice. Uncle was focusing on his favorite fillets and anything fried. The manager had approached my father and asked if could calm my uncle down. It was a $3 buffet he was losing profit on at that moment. Dad said, "You said it was all you can eat, right?" At the least by then, my uncle was done and ready to leave for cocktails. Mom and Dad left quietly with Uncle with a good laugh. The following Thursday, Uncle was there with his wife, and they were sitting down. Now, we had 2 foodies that loved food. After they both cleared the buffet for the second time, they were asked to leave by the manager. The following Thursday, and the one next after, my uncle and his wife showed up for the buffet again. The next month, the seafood restaurant decided to discontinue the Thursday buffet. When the next owners took over 3 decades later, that restaurant they considered bringing back the buffet, when my father overheard that. My father warned them and told them about my uncle. Did they listen? No. By then, my uncle was out of the chefing biz and now focused on eating. You should have seen the gleam in my uncle's face when he heard the seafood restaurant brought back buffet lunch. He cleaned them out for a month, and the restaurant yet again retired the all-you-can-eat buffet. After the passing of my uncle, passed from diabetes complications, Dad had a chit-chat with the owners of the seafood restaurant. Dad said to him frankly, "It's safe to run the buffet table again." They brought back the buffet table that year. My uncle's picture is on the walls of that restaurant, a picture of my uncle and the tower of plates in front of him. When I think of this story, I think my uncle is in heaven right now. Maybe in God's kitchen in front of a stove. Either that or the only guy up there dancing with a Subway sandwich in his hands. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.